Hey, I'm Richard, and this is our third episode on the projects, the ideas, and the people of Braver Angels, a national campaign led by volunteers who work across divides and bring thousands of citizens together. Francis Collins and Wilkinson are our guests.
Every time what happens is the moderator says, so, okay, let's hear from everybody. What did you learn from this? Invariably, the answer is, we're not that far apart. Boy, do we need more of that.
Once you get to know them, once you scrape away those base layers, you can start to have a conversation on just about anything if you are open enough to see the humanity in that other person.
Our show is about fixes.
Yeah, how to make the world a better place.
How do we fix it?
How do we fix it?
A deplorable and an elitist walk into a bar. One way to describe the partnership between two unlikely friends. Doctor and scientist Francis Collins was director of the National Institutes of Health. He served under 3 presidents, Republican and Democrat. Wilkinson is a Christian conservative and host of D-Rate the Hate, a podcast that features conversations between those of different mindsets and opinions. Wilk lives and works in central Minnesota. He grew up poor, living mostly in rural towns across the upper Midwest. Today, Wilk and Francis help lead the Braver Angels Truth and Trust Project, an effort to build respect among people who have very different views about pandemic public health policies. Wilk strongly objected to how the government handled COVID. As director of the NIH, Francis was right at the center of the federal response to the worst global pandemic in more than 100 years. Here's our interview. Francis and Wilk, welcome to How Do We Fix It?
Nice to be here.
Yeah, it's a real honor. Thank you very much, Richard.
Wilk, I want to start with you. You were highly critical of the federal government's response to the COVID pandemic that started in the winter of 2020. Francis played a central role in leading the government's response to COVID. So, Wilk, first, what were a few of your objections? What bothered you the most about what you were seeing and hearing?
When I look at anything that involves the government, the first thing I look at things through is the lens of liberty. If the one entity out there that has a monopoly on force is going to start restricting the liberties of the individual, they better be rock solid 100% sure that what they're doing is really the only option. The pandemic first began and things first started becoming public, and people were very scared. They didn't know what was going on. The powers that be were just doing these different things that to me seemed very intense, very extreme. But at first it seemed like, okay, well, 2 weeks to flatten the curve. This might make sense. Let's do what we're being told or do what we're being asked. Well, in the area in which I live, we just weren't seeing anything happening for weeks and weeks. And
when you say you weren't seeing anything happening, what do you mean?
The things that were going on, even with the people that worked, reported to me at my regular career at the time, we just weren't seeing the same kind of things that they were talking about on the news.
You weren't seeing COVID.
We weren't seeing COVID. We weren't seeing people. The only thing that we were seeing was the effects of the pandemic response. And that is businesses being closed and restaurants being shut down and all the toilet paper and all the stores from here to Timbuktu was missing. It was nightmarish, not because of the pandemic, but because of the pandemic response. So everybody was just getting very agitated. Their lives were disrupted. Family members started fighting with family members because people became fed up really quickly with the idea that 2 weeks to flatten the curve became two months to convince you that you should still be scared. It was a very, very hard time But the things that we were seeing on the news, the things that that were being used to basically keep the public in fear, is kind of the way that I felt about it, were not things that were close to home. They weren't things that we were seeing.
Francis, you were in Washington, D.C. You were also having a really rough time. I believe you said that you were working 100 hours a week and that COVID, in some respects, must have been your worst nightmare, this terrible pandemic, the worst in 100 years. So, how did things look to you at the time?
Well, my job was mostly to try to organize the research response, which meant trying to convene all of the scientific capabilities we needed to get them to work together. So that was asking industry to drop the usual sort of legal concerns about working with academics, to get FDA to come to the table, get everybody to write master protocols about how we were going to do the research, and of course to jumpstart as fast as we could the vaccine preparation, which we thought was going to be the best hope to do something about the lives that were being lost. I was sort of involved in the public health recommendations. I eventually became part of the White House coronavirus response team in the Situation Room, but that was much more driven by the CDC and their recommendations. And so I was totally aware of what Wilk is referring to in terms of the absolute devastation that this pandemic was creating in big cities like New York, where you saw the trucks pulling up to the morgue because there were too many dead bodies to fit in the usual spaces. And I saw the count, which sometimes was reaching thousands a day of people who were dying and the ICUs that were overflowing. And so the idea of trying to flatten the curve to give the hospitals a chance to recover made a lot of sense. But I didn't have a whole lot of idea about what was going on in Minnesota or in the heartland as a whole. It was so much focused on the places of heavy population density where there was heavy death happening. So I was totally then trying to figure out, though, how do we come up with responses to this? Therapeutics, better diagnostic tests that got off to a really bad start, and a vaccine that might actually put an end to what seemed like this horrendous loss of life that was just escalating almost daily in the spring of 2020.
And then you got a vaccine in record time that worked far better than you'd even hoped. And I assume you then probably thought, well, gosh, everybody's going to get on board with this. And that didn't happen.
Yeah, Richard, that was my greatest heartache. When they unblinded the data from the very large scale, rigorously designed, randomized, double blind control of the Pfizer and the Moderna mRNA vaccines late in November of 2020. And the results went far beyond what I had dared to hope for, showing 90 to 95% efficacy, and at least in that very large group, no real concerns as far as safety signals. I was just overwhelmed. I thought this is an answer to prayer. This is something where science has really risen to the challenge. And I had this confidence then that at least moving into 2021, we're going to be in a place to be able to stop the terrible deaths that were happening. And as you know, we did for a lot of people. Commonwealth Fund estimates about 3.1 million lives were saved by that vaccine. But a whole bunch of other lives were not, from people who decided this was not trustworthy. So we lost the battle somewhere along the way with 50 million Americans who no longer trusted the information that was coming from people like me and were instead suspicious.
Speaking of suspicious, were both of you suspicious of each other when you first met?
I well, I obviously I can't speak for Francis here, but when Francis came to Brave Angels for the first time, I really was not suspicious. I take people at face value, and when I understood what it was that he seemed to be trying to do, and they asked me if I would have a conversation with him, I went into that full heart, eyes, ears open, wanting to really know why he was here. Yeah, there was not really a suspicious part for me anyway.
Francis?
Yeah, I wasn't suspicious, but I was apprehensive. This was by now early 2022. I had stepped down as NIH director at the end of 21. And I had had a barrage of things coming at me from very angry people in my email for a while, including some pretty significant physical threats. And I was a little bit, on the defensive here. And hearing that I was going to be paired up by Braver Angels with somebody who felt very strongly that the public health response to COVID had been a mistake, I was, kind of uneasy about how that was going to go. And but I wasn't suspicious. I knew that this was a substantive, thoughtful person, and I also knew that Wilk was running a podcast called Derate the Hate, that he was really into this issue of trying to have conversations and discussions and listen to each other and not just demonize and throw vitriol at somebody you don't agree with. So I knew it was going to be a substantive, content based conversation.
Both of you have had many conversations together over the past 2.5 years. You first met each other after Braver Angels brought you together.
Yeah, I had gone to Braver Angels shortly after I stepped down at NIH, deeply troubled about the divisiveness and the polarization that I saw on many things, but of course, particularly on public health. Hearing about their model where they try to bring people together across blues and reds and actually get people to listen to each other and learn from each other. And I thought, that's what I need. I just needed to learn from this framework. And I was told Wilk is the guy who can tell you what's really happened in the real world.
Both of you have been working together on what is called the Truth and Trust Project. What is it?
Well, Richard, the Truth and Trust Project was it really was something that Francis and I had come up with. We started talking about truth and trust and what that meant and how we were going to rebuild trust between the everyday American that's out here working in the heartland, those who devise these policies that we all have to live by. We determined that it was going to take a lot of truth to rebuild the trust. So we called it the Truth and Trust Project. And I'll let Francis take it from there.
And that involved then, Richard, a number of gatherings, again, put together in the Braver Angels model, where equal numbers of people from each side of the divide about what happened with public health, mostly aligned with political party, because that's where we seem to have ended up, would express their views quite strongly about what they felt had been done right and what had been done wrong. But in a circumstance where the format required everybody to listen, I mean, really listen, not just to plan a snappy response, but listen to understand, and then talk back to each other what you heard. And even after people get a little bit more comfortable with the format, be willing to talk about things that they had done themselves that maybe didn't help, which was a big part of this. As soon as somebody does that in one of these sessions, then something changes. And everybody in the framework begins to feel like, okay, it's a safe place where I don't have to say I have all the answers, because none of us really do. And my gosh, by the time you go through this kind of conversation with 12 or 15 people over the course of an hour and a half, at the end of it, every time what happens is the moderator says, so, okay, let's hear from everybody. What did you learn from this? Invariably, the answer is, we're not that far apart. Boy, do we need more of that.
What are the goals of the Truth and Trust Project? Francis?
We're going to have another pandemic, This is not the last one. If we do not learn the lessons from what went right and what went wrong with this one, then we're going to be in a terrible spot. And our goal, I think, by small or eventually larger groups, including that convention we had in Gettysburg, where Wilk and I had a chance to speak in front of hundreds of people.
This is last year when Braver Angels brought together about 700 Reds, Blues, and Independents for several days together.
That's right. And we had a panel, Wilk and myself, to talk about our differences in terms of what happened with public health, the things that we've learned from each other, and the fact that we have learned also to be friends and to have an opportunity to both disagree, and we still do, about a number of issues, but not be disagreeable about it, and hoping that would be a model for others to begin to try to adapt to their circumstances and their issues.
In Gettysburg last year, I came across this phrase for the first time. An elitist and a deplorable walked into a bar. It's such a playful way of describing what you have been doing together. So what does that mean to you, Wilk?
Oh, the funniest thing about this, Richard, is I've made the joke that I've spent in my lifetime more time on a bar stool than I have in a classroom. But we built that conversation on the idea that two guys that really don't have anything in common other than the fact that, just our common humanity, the fact that we're both, men out here trying to better the world that we live in. But what kind of conversation would we have if we were sitting on a bar stool next to each other, right? An elitist, an academic elite, intellectual elite, whatever you want to call them. Yeah, that's that guy, right? And then me, what are one of the former presidential candidates of days past called a deplorable. What happens if those two men sit down on a bar stool next to each other, getting to know the humanity in this other human being that is just another beautiful person? Once you get to know them, once you scrape away those base layers, you can start to have a conversation on just about anything if you are open enough to see the humanity in that other person. And that's what we've been trying to do with this thing. It's been a beautiful experiment. It's spawned a beautiful friendship.
We're hearing from Francis Collins and Wilkinson. They're both helping to lead the Braver Angels Truth and Trust Project. And this is our third episode on the people, the projects, and ideas of Braver Angels. We have a lot more shows in the works. Find out more at howdowefixit.me. Please subscribe to How Do We Fix It, and if you like what you hear, leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts. I wanted to ask you both this. What have you learned together during the Truth and Trust workshops and your conversations that you mentioned have stretched into many hours?
I think I probably was feeling pretty defensive and embattled after the experience of 2020 and 2021, with so much coming back at me in terms of angry criticism, almost to the point where it was hard for me to see past the mean-spirited comments, to see these are just regular folks trying to live their lives, where this whole thing has put them in a very bad place. And I had stopped, I think, being able to really listen to what the background was of some of these very strong critiques of what had happened. And also had maybe slipped into the dimension of thinking that people who didn't see the things the way that I did, well, they just hadn't paid attention. They had paid attention. So I learned a lot by listening. And Wilk was a really good person to listen to about how different the COVID-19 pandemic was for somebody who was in a very different place than I was, trying to manage a big medical research effort and to watch the whole country going into spasms. I hadn't really thought about how critical it would have been, and we failed at this, to have the public health recommendations actually be more individualized for the circumstances of particular communities. That didn't really happen. Part of that was, I'm sorry to say, the fact that our public health system has been so drastically underfunded over many years that many communities really didn't have anybody who knew what to do about that. But a lot of it was heavy-handed kind of insistence on a one-size-fits-all approach that just didn't fit everywhere. I also learned from talking to Wilk and other people in these Truth and Trust sessions about how sometimes the pronouncements from people like me in public communication came across as very elitist, very much like I know what to do and you just have to do what I say, as opposed to really explaining the circumstance about how imperfect the data was and how uncertain we all often were about whether we were recommending the thing that was going to turn out to be right. And if it wasn't, we might have to change that. And we should have warned people that that change was coming, because that's how science works. And we were working in real time on a nasty pandemic experiment that we didn't have control of.
Wilk, what have you learned from your conversations with Francis?
Well, one of the biggest things that I've taken away from this and so much of my other work with Braver Angels, but is the idea that we get ourselves into a lot of trouble when we ascribe motives to people for things that they've done without having any idea who that person really is, or without having been in their shoes. And I've done it myself. I've seen other people do it. I've seen the ugliness that builds within a person when they become very angry based on either misinformation or partial information, and then they use that anger to look for a boogeyman. And when they're looking for that boogeyman, they start to ascribe these evil motives to that person, and instead of trying to figure out what was their decision making process, they automatically turn it into this person has done this for this reason. This is something that I was notorious for years ago, and I would just assume that I knew that this person did this for this reason, and it was obviously evil intentions, or it was, there was obviously ulterior motives here. And so one of the biggest things that I've learned out of this project, Richard, is to really sit down with people and just, just start to ask the question, like our friend Monica Guzman says, how did you come to believe what you believe?
I know these conversations around truth and trust are not aimed at having everybody agree with one another. What do both of you still disagree about?
Well, I think probably we still have some pretty fundamental disagreements about the government's appropriate role in lots of activities, certainly including public health. I would say mandates, unfortunately, in COVID had mostly a negative effect by making people just even more angry and resistant. But if you had a infection that you knew was lethal, not just to old people, but to young people, and that the only way you could stop the transmission was mandating such things as isolation, masks, and so on, then I would think a government might, in that circumstance, need to take that action. But you have to be very restrictive about it. I do think that public health has responsibilities sometimes to ask people to do things they don't want to do, and that there are times where individual liberties have to also include responsibilities that may be uncomfortable for the individual, but are perhaps necessary for the community.
I think if it was a sliding scale on where the government's role begins and where the individual's role to rule themselves begins, yeah, we're going to fall on a different spot on that sliding scale for sure. So there's some disagreement there. I absolutely agree with what he says as far as mandates. I won't say that mandates are never a good idea, because I don't like to speak in absolutes anymore. If the government is going to restrict the liberties of an individual, they better be very, very, very sure that that is the best and only way to accomplish said goal. And I think that was one of the biggest failures of the pandemic response, was being quick to mandate things, and then improperly communicating the importance of why these things were done. And then the reality is I am much closer to the idea that we should have, used a much more targeted response for the more vulnerable, than Francis.
But Francis, you do admit that there were communications failures by the government, right?
Oh, yeah. And that got me in some trouble because not everybody wanted to have that said out loud, but I had to.
What are your regrets about that?
Yeah, looking back, a couple of things. One is I wish we had every time a communication was being made about a public health recommendation that the uncertainty would have been included in the recommendation so that it didn't come across as, okay, we've got the answer now, because we rarely did. And we knew that the data was changing. Sometimes the data was slow coming in. People were dying. You were trying to do the best you could with the recommendation that you had in front of you, with the data you had, knowing that it might not be right. We should have been more clear about that and kind of brought the public along as partners instead of like an audience that we're going to give edicts to. The other thing is, I wish we'd done a better job of democratizing the communication process. It came across very top down and, yeah, kind of elitist. Instead of having community voices, empowered people at different levels who could be seen as part of communities, instead of it all coming across in a way that seemed pretty far away from the lives of many people. And I don't think that helped. We could have done a better job, for instance, of getting the doctors more engaged in the community as part of the information sharing. They were trying, but they weren't getting a lot of help.
Before we go, let's focus a little on the future. Francis, you have a book coming out. You're about to give birth to a brand new baby book. The Road to Wisdom, on Truth, Science, Faith, and Trust is the title. Tell us a little bit about it.
I felt so concerned, and this was with me before COVID, but it got intensely with me during COVID about what's happened to our society with the polarization, with the divisiveness, with the ways in which that has made it oftentimes impossible to figure out what's actually true, or even to get everybody to agree that truth matters. How many times have you heard somebody say, well, that might be true for you, but it's not true for me? And that would be fine if they're talking about the excellence of a particular movie. But if it's about an established fact, information that really doesn't care how you feel about it, it's just true, then we're getting into a really bad place. Science gets it wrong sometimes, but science is inherently self-correcting over time. Anything that matters is going to be challenged and validated or not. So it's a way you can learn about nature that's generally helped served us well. But distrust of science has been growing rapidly. And then faith is in my book too, because I'm a person of faith, and I'm particularly concerned that faith communities have been very vulnerable to a lot of misinformation and have also, maybe for historical reasons, not necessarily been the first to put their trust in science. And that's dangerous, I think. Faith communities also ought to be in the best position to come forward and say, we're not going to tolerate all this uncivil discourse. We're people of love. We love our neighbors. And yet, many faith communities, I think, have gotten more trapped in political posturing than they have in remembering what the Sermon on the Mount said about what Jesus calls us to. So all of that's in the book, and it's basically then trying to make a bit of a diagnosis and then calling on individuals, because I think that's where the solution's coming from. It's not from politicians. Individuals to basically decide to be part of the solution and not just check out right now.
In the last chapter of The Road to Wisdom, there is a pledge that readers and citizens are asked to commit to. Wilk, you and Francis both discussed the wording for this. What does it say, this pledge?
Well, the Road to Wisdom pledge, and actually, if you go to roadtowisdompledge.com, it'll take you to a Braver Angels site. But that pledge is just as Francis said. It's a chance for people to basically commit to themselves, to say, before I share information that I found on the internet, I'm gonna do my due diligence to find out if this is actually true.
The pledge also asks people to do what we were talking about in the Braver Angels kind of model. Reach out to people who think don't agree with you, but actually try to listen and try to understand and see if you can be a bridge builder instead of somebody who's off in your own bubble off in the corner, because we got to do more of that too. So this particular pledge will be public. Signature number 1 is Wilkinson. Signature number 2 is Francis Collins. And we got a bunch of people at the Braver Angels meeting in Kenosha to sign on. But what I hope is when the book comes out September 17th, and we'll start to see thousands, tens of thousands, oh my gosh, maybe millions of people who go, yeah, I want to be part of this. I'm willing to go public with my commitment to be part of the solution.
Both of you, thank you very much for coming on How Do We Fix It? And before we end this, I should mention that Wilk has a podcast, Derate the Hate. So if you want to hear more great conversations with people who may disagree with each other without being disagreeable, then listen to Wilk's fine podcast. And thanks again, both of you.
Thanks, Richard. Great to talk to you.
Francis and Wilk of the Truth and Trust Project. Learn more at braverangels.org and find out about its goals and achievements. We also have a link to Francis's book and Wilk's Derate the Hate podcast on our website, which is howdowefixit.me. I'm Richard Davies. Our excellent producer is Miranda Schaefer. This podcast is a production of Davies Content. We make audio and offer media training at daviescontent.com. Thanks for listening.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group,